Namaste and good morning to everybody for this week's Monday weekly discourse. And it's a joy to be back with you again today, and good evening to those of you in India. And today I'd like to address a topic that was stimulated in my mind by a question that was sent to me. You know how I always ask you people to send in questions? Well, one person did send in a question that piqued my interest a little bit. And I may not be answering it quite exactly right. I mean, in terms of the intention of that person's question, but I think it's close enough. And the question that came to me was, a person asked, it was, it was it was sort of, a person said this way: I feel called to share my wisdom with other people, but I feel some inner resistance to that. And I think the implication I get from this is that the person who was asking the question wants to share it, and perhaps to teach in some fashion, but is reluctant to do so for any number of reasons, not really specified. And the questioner goes on to say that by not acting on this feeling, there's maybe a sense that they're not fulfilling their inner dharma. This might not be a good thing. And what should they do? And I thought about it a little bit, and I'd like to broaden that question out just a little bit so that it's not particularly addressed only to that question, but just something that might be more general that is pertinent to all of us. And there's a story in the Bible that Jesus tells. It's a parable story, as most of those stories are, that there's a master and his servants, and the master is going away, and he leaves his wealth, referred to as talents. You know, talent in those days and Roman days were money, another name for money. Probably maybe it was gold coins or something like that. But he leaves his talents with his servants to look after while he's gone. And with him, three servants, one, he gives 5 talents to one, 2 talents to the other, and 1 talent to the third person. And he says, I'm going away and secure these for me while I'm gone. And when I come back, then give them back. And now this has a lot of symbolic meaning. But he goes away, he comes back, and the first servant says, oh, master, you had given me 5 talents. And when you left, what I did is I thought the best use of these, I invested these for you. And I now return you the 5 talents, but I return also, in addition to that, 5 talents more. They increased. And the master says, oh, that's wonderful. Very good. You're a good servant to have done this. And I praise you for your efforts. Second one comes back, and he had been given 2 talents. And he says the same thing. He says, well, you were gone. I put these talents to work, and you gave me 2. I give you the 2 back, and I give you an additional 2 talents that I was able to generate from this. And of course, he praises, master does, this servant as well. The third man comes back, and he says, master, you gave me the 1 talent to take care of. I give it back to you. But I was afraid that I would lose the talents, and I didn't want to do that because I know they are precious to you. So I buried them, and I give them back to you now. I gave that 1 talent back. And the master was not pleased. He says, you worthless servant. That says, you did nothing with it and just merely gave back what was given to you. And he criticized the servant for that. And then he goes on to say, the parable, you might say the message of the parable was, he says, to those who have, more shall be given. And to those who have not, even that which they have will be taken away from them. Now, it's a very curious line because a person thinks about that. To those who have, more shall be given. It's as if Jesus is saying there, he says, the rich shall get richer and the poor shall get poorer. And there's some truth to actually that with that message, but of course, not necessarily in the worldly sense, but he was speaking it in more of in a mystical sense. And in the story is that it's past been that saying, don't hide your talents under a rock, has been, you might say, the message that has been passed down over the ages. Although the servant didn't actually hide it under a rock, he said he just buried it. And in another place in the Bible, Jesus Christ says, don't hide your light under a bushel. In other words, you light a candle. He says, you don't take a candle and then stick it somewhere in a dark place and hide it. You use it to shine and light things, to create light. And the message here is meaningful on many different levels. And of course, talent in those days was money. And in other discourses, we've talked about how money is not really something. What it is just merely a representation of energy. So you could look on this story as energy used and put to work generates more energy, generates magnetism. So consequently, if you have energy and you sit on it and you don't do anything, what happens is it atrophies and it demagnetizes, and eventually even that energy is taken away from you. And this, you could say, this is a basic principle of life. If you're given something, life is not static. In other words, it either increases or it decreases. And you could say us on the spiritual path, we're moving up toward the light, or if we think, well, I'm just going to stay static, it's not that way. You end up decreasing in your magnetism. So it's one or the other. And so you could take it in that way as well. But I think you could also, in the modern sense, using the word talent, and that's, I think maybe this is actually where the English word talent comes from, is because talents used to be in the Roman times a unit of money. Our talents in the sense of abilities is something also we've been given. We've been given, you could say, God gives us these talents. Well, you could say it that way, but also it's a samskar, it's an inclination. It's probably something, a talent is things we have developed over past lifetimes. And so you could say it's a gift. Maybe we had to work for that gift. But the question arises to, what should we do with these talents? I have a real talent for something. What do I do with it? Should I develop it? Or let's say you have a talent for business. Should I do that? Or is that something that's going to be a distraction for me? And so people often, they have talents that are real, not just talents that are, you might say, a desire. Oh, I want to learn to play the guitar. And some people may have been a great musician in past lives, and that's a natural thing. Others, maybe it's just not really so much the guitar or music, it's for some other reason. So, but a real talent, all of us come in, whether it's an outward thing or certain traits, you could say, that are talents. What do we do? What's the best use of these things? Because sometimes people misuse talents, and they really are a distraction to us. But on the other hand, people have real talents, and we think, well, gosh, maybe I should put these things to work. If I don't, maybe I'm being untrue to myself. And like this person asked, they felt a certain impulse. Now, I don't know if that was a talent or just an impulse of passing impulse, but they felt some impulse to do something, and they weren't fulfilling it. Now, admittedly, here, before we go down that road, a person needs to have some discrimination. Is it just a desire, or is it actually some impulse from the past that perhaps is like a tool? Because that's what talents are, really. And I think it's a good way to look at our talents, because I think generally, assuming that they're not obviously negative. Talents are generally good things to develop. They're tools. And if a person is given certain tools in life, to not put those tools to work, ultimately they sit in the tool shed and they rust and they're not used. But a tool that is kept sharp and is useful, generally it's a good thing to develop one's talents. You generate energy, it gives us a sense of direction, it helps us with our concentration. And I think most importantly, they can help perfect ourselves in many different ways. And especially they can be an avenue for sharing those tools, you might say, with others. And the best, and if you think, what's the best function if you have a tool? What's the best, what is a tool for? What's its function? It's to accomplish a job. You use a tool to get something done. You want to put it to work. And if you don't put it to work, well, then you forget how to use it, perhaps. The tool degenerates, and you might say it's wasted in that way. Now, the question comes up, well, how do we judge that for ourselves? And I think we need to look, because we're often given many, many, many things, inclinations, samskars. We come into this work. Can we express and perfect all of those at one time and in one lifetime? Some people, of course, are like that. They're great musicians, they're great mathematicians, they're great singers, they're all of these. And so actually, Swami Kriyananda was a little bit like that. He had many great tools, developed many of them. But the important thing to remember with all of our talents, those things that have been given to us, those are abilities, is we have to say, what is those talents for that's given to us? And we need to prioritize, set priorities in our life. And then if we can use those talents to be able to help accomplish those priorities, we find that then they become useful. They help us achieve our goal in life. And of course, as a devotee, our priority is to seek God, to bring joy into our lives, and then to share that with other people as a means to ultimately into our own joy in life. So we have to look in terms of our talents in that way. And sometimes when it's not an obvious thing, I remember many years ago, there was a fellow that came to the Ananda ashram, and he had been a businessman in an oil company. And I remember he used to have shirts that had the name of his oil company on it. They have, when you work for a company, they give you shirts and things with logos on it. And he had these logos of this oil company on on his clothing. And as I asked him about it, he says, well, I used to work for them. I was in sales and whatever, in management. And I asked him if he enjoyed his work, and he said, it was okay, but I just was so tired of it by the time I left. I never, ever want to do that kind of work again. In other words, because he was handling money, finances, sales, and he was so he says, it was so worldly. I just never want to do that again. I thought, okay. So he became a member of our ashram, and actually to this day he still is. This is now decades later. And it was very interesting. He stayed away from business for a few years, and then slowly he became, his talent for it was there. It was an inclination, and he actually had a talent. And he began to, you could say, karma impelled him to find his way into serving Ananda Sangha, Ananda Village at that time, here in California, in business manner, in one way or the other. And he began to put it to use. And this fellow ultimately became part of our team, or business management team of the financial department here. And he did a very good job. But you see what happened. He never wanted to do that work again, but he found that talent, he found a way to spiritualize and use his talent in a good way. And he developed it. And he learned a lot of lessons from it. And he did actually come to a point where he put it aside, and he went on to other things in his later years, you might say his retirement years. But he kind of I don't know if he worked it out of his system, as they say, but he certainly put it up. He was able to develop that way. So we have to look in terms of if we have a tool, put that tool to use if it serves our purpose to achieve what our ultimate goal is. And oftentimes, those talents have been things that we've developed in the past. And if we take them and perfect them, we find that they can be very, very useful. Now, Swamiji was like that with his songwriting. Now, when he was a young man, he was musically inclined, but he saw that he and his music teacher had great hope for him as a singer and just as a vocalist. But Swami wasn't particularly, he liked singing, but he felt it was shallow and it wasn't enough. And he was singing different things of different composers. And he just said it wasn't fulfilling to him. And he put it totally aside when he became a monk, and he never picked it up again, until after years later, a decade, 2.5 later, when he was put out of Self-Realization Fellowship. He was in a situation where he was asked, he could sing, and so he was just casually singing, for his own enjoyment with other people. And then an idea struck him. Maybe I could use my singing to share Master's teachings. And the idea struck him. He said, that's a good idea, because he was wanting to share Master's teachings, and he had not thought about it in terms of music. And so he looked about and he said, really, nobody else was doing that. And so he says, why don't I do that? And as soon as he had that idea, he says, very quickly thereafter, songs began to come into his consciousness. And he began to write, and it's like out of the ether, they began to come to him. And he began to write songs. And then he thought, well, it'd be nice if I could actually play a musical instrument. I think he probably played some piano, but he said that you can't be carrying a piano around with him. And so he thought, well, I'll learn to play the guitar. And he taught himself how to play the guitar. And these songs kept flooding him. And it was time passed, and he ended up hundreds and hundreds of songs. And it became a mechanism by which he could share Yogananda's teachings. And in a sense, that was it was a tool. But it was a tool, but his priority was to share the teachings. And he used that tool. And in the same way, there's many other skills that he had. He began to find that if he developed those skills, it was like releasing energy. And he found himself joyously expressing and using those tools because he had a high purpose for them. And they became, not only fulfilling for him, they were serviceful to others, and a great sense of personal enjoyment and fulfillment for him. So this is, you could say, the right use of it. But Swami tells a story about another fellow young man who came to him, who was also a pretty good musician. And he would compose little songs and chants and so on. But they were, I guess the man asked Swamiji and was talking to him about his music, that he said he wanted to create music, and he was looking for opportunities to create music. And he asked Swamiji, haven't you ever felt that? I just have this inner desire, this inner need to create music. And Swami said to him, no, I've never felt that. He says, I don't have a need. In other words, I don't feel a compulsion to do that. It's not a compulsion. And I don't have a need inwardly drive to share. And Swami made the point, he says, if you have that sort of a compulsion in that way, the tendency is, and this is what he later mused about this fellow, he says, it's generally driven from ego. He says, because why the need? And he says it tends to be an ego need. It's not a soul need. but the desire to share is good. So the desire, a need to share, that's a soul impulse, because whenever we share, we feel a greater sense of joy. And we've said this often, many times, that desire to share is a good thing, but the need to express oneself tends to drive us. There's other things going on there. And I remember a Christian teacher, Thomas Merton, said, the silence, inner soul silence, comes when we can overcome the need to be heard. In other words, it's an ego need to be heard. You want somebody to hear what you've got to say. Listen to me. Well, that's usually ego-driven. So consequently, this was something, but separating those two for the devotee is important. You have the tool, but not necessarily from a need. But the idea to share, that's good. And so I think this is what we want to, it's something to fulfill that soul desire to share is what we're after. And to fulfill that soul desire to use our talents in a way that brings us closer to God. But whether somebody hears our music or not, if you that's you could say that's where the ego starts to get involved. And I think people sense that. And maybe this question that was asked to me, this person had a desire to share their wisdom, their knowledge, but they were a little bit hesitant. And it may have been a subtle recognition that, is this coming from the ego, or is this something that's pure? Now, usually we don't know these things until we actually try it and see. And the desire to share with other people is something that should be cultivated. And I recommend, well, check it out and see, but be self-aware enough to be able to watch yourself, because you're not going to know unless you actually do it. And yes, you may make a mistake. You may say, oh, that's ego-driven, but you're not going to be able to know that until you actually do it and you check yourself and to see, is this, what's the motivation behind this? And so this, I think, so this, in terms of any talent we have, generally speaking, they're, commonsensically, in a general sense, it's good to share. It's good to express those desires, because you don't want to be like that servant who puts things under a rock because your energy, it doesn't allow that energy to express, because you're fearful, you might say, of misusing your talent. Yes, you may misuse it, but it's better to purify it and be self-aware enough to know, no, I know there may be some ego here. My ego may get in the way. But what do you do if you have an ego? Does it mean you never use your ego? No, you have to learn the lesson of purifying. And that's, you could say, the spiritual devotee's job, incarnation after incarnation, is to purify what has been given to us, this body, personality. Don't worship it, purify it. And don't be afraid of it, purify it, hold it in check, and use it for a good purpose. And I think this is, so if we have tendencies, try to find good uses for those tendencies. And in the process, you might say you uncover them, and it gives you a chance to see where their faults are there. Sometimes people bury their tendencies because they don't want to see the faults. That's not going to get us anywhere, because they're there still, they're just buried. And this is what happens when people suppress. What avails one, as it says in the Gita, what avails suppression? It doesn't help you in any way at all. You have to be able to take them out of hiding and look at them, and then figure out, what am I going to do with them? And little by little, put them to use in a positive way. And then you find that slowly, life itself will give you feedback, and you'll begin to find that little by little, you'll begin to make those perfect reflections, to get rid of those imperfections in those talents. And I think Swami used to say that, Mozart, a great composer, he was writing symphonies before the age of 5. I remember there was a story that when he was just a little boy, he heard a piece of music, and this person that wrote this piece of music was asked to write it so that other people could play it too. But he was possessive of it. He didn't want other people playing his music. They would, quote unquote, steal it from him, and he felt it was his. But it was a beautiful piece nevertheless. And so Mozart heard it one time, a very long piece too. He heard it one time, and immediately he could write the whole thing out from first to last. He was only a boy. So he was a genius in that way. But then Swami used to say, after after you've been a Mozart for 2 or 3 lifetimes, aren't you going to get tired of that music? Of being a musician, you're going to want to do something else. And he said, I don't, because many people think, well, if Mozart was a great musician in that lifetime, oh, he must be one of the great musicians in this lifetime. Swami said, it's not necessarily so. Any talents, when it's directed outwardly, and I think to some degree that was Mozart's case as well, but many people in a worldly sense, when they have a worldly talent in some way, they get tired of it. Because it's unfulfilling. So any talent that we have outwardly expressed, which is somewhat egoic, you're going to get tired of it, no matter how good you get at it, how many wonderful meals at a fine restaurant can you eat over and over again until you say, I don't want that anymore. And so it is. But a talent used to express divinity becomes ever new. It's because it's not the outer that is important. It's the joy that you develop through offering something up to God. And it's just merely a tool, and it is what it is. And maybe next lifetime it'll be a different tool. But the power you develop of being able to sharpen that tool in this life, that we take with us. We may not want to become a Mozart again, if you're Mozart, but you've got a certain skill to be able to develop yourself in other ways. So a personality, something refined in one direction, can be then used in another direction. And ultimately, that direction all of us want to use our talents for is to be able to develop our skill, if you call it that, in being able to attract God's love to us. We want to develop that power of magnetism, of energy, that talent of energy. You want to be able to use that talent to not just return 5 talents for 5 talents given to you, but 10, 15, a multiple of that energy given to us, that we express it, and in the divine way, we be able to attract God's love back in abundance. And so this is the right use of our talents, because they're not ours. To the degree we think this belongs to me, to that degree we limit it, because God is, you could say, given each of us in our own way, our own unique talents. And we all have talent. Now, some person might think, well, I have no talents at all. That's not true. We are because each individual is a unique creation of God, and each creation, it's like a stained glass window, can be made beautiful. And each of those colors in the stained glass window, in a sense, they're a talent to be beautiful, but it's not the glass that's beautiful, it's the light shining through the glass that makes it beautiful. And so to think, oh, look how wonderful I am. Well, of course, that's the ego. And a few years pass, and if we don't let that light shine and recognize the true source of that light, slowly it becomes dim. And we don't want that as devotees. And so use what talents have been given to you, recognize the source of where those talents are, and use those talents in a way that helps to uplift everybody. Share, but share in that spirit that this is God that you're sharing. And if those talents recede, if they go, others develop, they're not yours in the first place. They're God's and have been given to you. And to the degree that you use them in a good way, they'll bring you joy, and they'll also increase and be able to share that joy also with others. And so